and welcome to this Astranti financial training top 10 issues guide to the November operational case study looking at our sample company Marici Power. During this guide what we're going to do is look at what I consider to be the top 10 most likely issues to come up in the unseen material you're given in the exam, and we're going to look at the best ways to prepare for those issues and the best way to tackle them during the exam itself. My name's Alex and I'm one of the case study specialists at Astranti Financial Training, and I've been looking at case studies across operational management and strategic for ages, so I have a really great idea of the best techniques for you to use moving forwards into the exam itself. As we think about how to prepare for these issues, a really important thing to consider is to remember that the unseen material is bound to change your point of view. The whole point of that extra material you're given is that it will change the scenarios with which Marici Power are faced. As such, what we can't do is just prepare our entire answer. That would be too easy. Although what we can do is, using these top 10 issues, we can figure out some supporting paragraphs including issues that we've taken from the wider solar industry as a whole, and we can prepare those in order to support our answer during the exam. With that in mind, as we go through these top 10 issues, I'm going to be peppering you with plenty of industry examples, and it's up to you then to think about which issues you can use those to support and to construct some sentences or paragraphs for your later use. One of the key things we're going to be looking at again as we go through each issue is models which can be used in order to structure an answer. For example, if we're thinking about stakeholders, one of the best models to use would be Mendelow's matrix in order to better understand the relationship which Marici Power has with its stakeholders. However, if we briefly go back to what we said earlier, we'd know that if we prepared our Mendelow's matrix in advance, we'd have to be prepared for an introduction of a new stakeholder in the unseen, or possibly some factor which changed our relationship with an existing stakeholder. As well as models, something that can be really helpful in structuring our answers is to look at the advantages and disadvantages of a point. For example, if we thought about international expansion for Marici Power, we could say that there were advantages including being less dependent on one market, less financial vulnerabilities as a result of that, but we could also say that disadvantages included exposure to exchange rate risk due to having to change the $, freelance currency, into other currencies. Just by remembering these advantages and disadvantages then, we've already got the basic structure of an answer without knowing what the exact material would be given during the unseen would be. Finally then, once we've constructed our arsenal of information, once we're equipped with our real life examples and our paragraphs, we've learnt our models and we've thought about our advantages and disadvantages, the best way to check whether you're prepared for the exam is to do some practice mock exams and see how you do in those. Anyone interested in acquiring mock exams can look at the operational case study section of the Astranti website. So, if you're ready, let's get stuck into our top 10 issues. And as we count our way down, we start with number 10, risk management. Risk management is one of the broader topics we'll cover during this video, and it covers everything from how Marici Power will deal with risk, their corporate attitude to risk, and specific risks that the company may be facing. One of the reasons that I think it's so important is it's a really big area of P1, and within it we've got this idea of risk identification. That said, one of the key things we need to highlight is that you won't be expected to undertake calculations during the exam. So for example, if we think about some risk identification and risk measurement methods, such as working out the value of perfect information, decision trees, sensitivity analysis, or standard deviations, you may be given information on these topics and expected to interpret it, but what you won't be expected to do is undertake any of those forms of identification or analysis yourself. Similarly, when we think about risk management techniques, what you'd be asked to do is recommend ways to do it rather than undertake the analysis itself, and of course you may be given information on the existing techniques which Marici Power are already using. The thing with risk management is that it is examined regularly and crops up fairly often as part of a larger question topic. So, let's have a little think about the likely issues that are going to come up with regards to Marici Power specifically, and the big one for me is subsidy and tariff changes. The reason I think this is so likely is because, to a greater extent, the company's finances depend on the continued health of the subsidy and tariff landscape. As such, when we think about risk management in terms of subsidy and tariff changes, what we're asking is what measures have been put in place in order to guarantee the company's income in the event that tariffs and subsidies suddenly fall. When we think about risk management and control, one of the things we can talk about are the potential vulnerabilities of the company. For example, Marici Power has a very small cash reserve of just over 200,000 $. And also the risks that are unique to the industry. For example, even when trading seems to be going well, the threat of sudden changes to subsidies and tariffs is a real indicator of things that can go suddenly south. A great real-world example to bring in at this point would be an American company called SunEdison, which, despite being labelled as a red-hot company or a red-hot industry, pursued quite a risk-heavy approach to expansion. They expanded aggressively, and due to changes in the subsidy landscape, they crashed into bankruptcy in April 2016. So SunEdison demonstrate that even in times of profit and expansion, we can't take risk for granted in this industry, and when we think about risk control, there are these factors that are definitely outside of our ability to control through internal measures. We will need to think about risk management on particular projects. For example, if we want to go into the utility scale market and undertake a larger installation than has previously been part of the Marici Power business model. But risk management's also something we can think about for the whole organisation based on anything we see as a risk in the pre-scene. One of the ones I've just identified is that small cash reserve potentially being a threat. They've also got very high debt, giving them low interest cover of just 1.1. So there are a number of financial risks that are easily identifiable throughout the pre-scene. Another key risk that we can talk about in terms of the solar market as a whole is the ability for large Chinese manufacturers to potentially undercut a company like Marici Power, and the risk that the EU trade deal signed in 2013, which currently protects Marici Power from cheaper Chinese imports, could change. Now this is an interesting one to bring up because in January 2016, the world's largest solar manufacturer, which is based in China, called Trina Solar, managed to get themselves exempt from that trade deal. One of the key things we can think about when discussing risk in the pre-scene is the potential role of an audit committee in terms of managing risk internally, and this is something we don't have any information on in the pre-scene, so it's something that we could potentially speculate about being a necessary addition to the company. Equally, as we don't have any information, it could be something that we're given information on during the unseen. A particularly interesting idea when it comes to risk with regards to Marici Power is this idea of their cultural attitude to risk. For example, what is their tolerance to risk and what is their risk appetite? Given the financial constraints on the company, we could say that their risk tolerance is probably relatively low. However, when it comes to risk appetite, it's possible that the culture of the company is undertaking a transition due to the recent purchase by Walla Solar. After all, despite Marici Power being in what's a tricky financial position after all, Walla Solar have taken the chance on purchasing them, so this indicates that possibly Walla Solar have quite a high risk appetite. This, combined with the low risk tolerance that there is within Marici Power, could potentially be a source of conflict and also a source of high risk when we think about risk management. Again, the SunEdison example would be a really good example here in terms of supporting an argument against having this high appetite for risk, And just to throw another name into the ring there, another massive company which bankrupted itself by overstretching itself financially was Solyndra. Those of you who've seen any of the other videos in this Astranti financial training series will know that I love talking about Solyndra because they managed to bankrupt themselves despite receiving over 500 million in government funding. So what key issues do we need to raise with regards to Marici Power specifically? Well, one of the big ones is we've got one supplier for our key component, that is polysilicon wafers, and that means we've got a really high risk to our business model if that supplier goes bust, if that supplier is unable to meet our ongoing demand for polysilicon, as this will almost entirely halt our production, leading to a severe impact on our ability to produce and our ability to generate profits. As such, when we think about this one supplier, it could be that we want to diversify and get our polysilicon from a number of different suppliers, or indeed it could be that we want to eliminate this risk entirely by producing polysilicon ourselves. One of the key factors to raise here is the idea that producing polysilicon is very expensive. It's a very energy intensive process, with the polysilicon being heated to over 2000 degrees centigrade, and the unseen may introduce information with regards to our supplier that makes having more suppliers impractical. For example, if our supplier is currently the best quality polysilicon manufacturer in the world, this could be one of our critical success factors, what makes our panels great, and so we would not want to undermine this by going to suppliers with supply a less good quality product. Indeed, when we think about supply and why it's so important, it's because we've got these low profits, and that means we're vulnerable to any change in our income streams, including changes to polysilicon supply, but also that big white elephant of changes to the financial landscape in terms of subsidies and tariffs. Another potential threat to our profits is this idea that customers could potentially go to any other form of energy in order to fulfill their energy needs. For example, if wind energy is particularly terrific or the efficiency is improving, we would anticipate profits to fall as more customers, particularly on a commercial scale, look to wind rather than solar as their form of energy. Anyway, more on that later. We also need to think about the fact we've got one major source of income. Indeed, when looking at the statement of cash flows given in the pre-scene, we see that almost all of Marici Power's profits in 2015 came from operations, meaning that should something undermine that, for example a problem at our one production facility, which we'll come back to when we talk about limited production, we will have almost no source of income. In thinking about ways to manage this risk, we can look at other companies that offer peripheral products, such as ongoing maintenance and ongoing cleaning services for customers that have bought their solar panels, as a way of raising revenue from an operation other than our production. A great example company to use when talking about this potential for other products is Solar Century. Just like Marici Power, they're based in a Western European capital city, they're based in London, and they offer their commercial customers a range of ongoing monitoring, maintenance and cleaning services, and generate a great deal of income in this way. As we move on then to think about another risk for Marici Power, this limited geographic market's one of the big ones. The pre-scene tells us that they get 85% of their income from within Freeland, meaning that they're particularly vulnerable to any changes in that domestic market. For example, if there's a recession affecting a people's willingness to buy solar panels, or if Freeland's government changes subsidies or tariffs. Indeed, we know from the pre-scene that that's something that's almost certain to come up, given that we've got the solar power news describing government cuts to solar power subsidies as a hammer blow for the industry. Moving on then to think about an issue which isn't necessarily dependent on this idea of tariffs and subsidies, is our limited production capacity. This is because we've only got that one production facility in the centre of Freeland, and this means we're vulnerable to anything happening at our one production facility, for example if it floods. But also if we're looking to expand our production to grow the business further, we've got the constraints of our ability to buy expensive land and expensive property in the centre of a Western European capital city. In thinking about ways to manage that particular risk, we could argue with regards to moving production to a less expensive area. For example, BP Solar moved their production to the Far East. Or we could also think about potentially keeping a smaller inventory in order to get what's described as a very large warehouse facility smaller and using some of that space to expand our production. Finally, here an issue I'm not going to spend too long, and that's the idea that we have limited products and markets. Yes, Marici Power sell a range of solar panels, appealing across a broad range of prices, but it is principally solar panels and solar panel systems that we sell, and as such we're very dependent on what is a small, freeland, domestic and small commercial solar panel market. Another thing we need to think about is the importance of embedded risk methodology. This may sound complicated, but what we mean is that risk management should be part of all of the decision-making processes within Marici naturally. So there we could talk about whether they have appropriate risk managers and appropriate auditors. Indeed, this is something that's really important, as risk management is a really popular topic at operational level, and it does take up that large amount of P1 as we said previously. Finally, we need to think about how we'll control risks, and what we're thinking about there is what measures we've put in place, and we do need to explain and really spell out for the examiner how our control will manage the risk in question. So what we'll now do is just briefly move on to look at the basis of my choice of risk management, and we have discussed some of these already. We've seen that there is a focus in the pre-scene on a number of risks, particularly that solar power news article highlighting the vulnerability to subsidies and tariff cuts, and that's part of a number of issues that are highlighted throughout the entire pre-scene. We also know from our previous experience at Astranti Financial Training that examiners want to see your ability to manage risk. We also know that it has strategic importance as it crops up as part of a SWOT analysis, that idea of looking at a company's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats in order to consider the best strategic direction for the company as a whole. After all, there are going to be risks inherent in taking your opportunities. Threats almost entirely embody risks, as do weaknesses. It's also really likely to be something that's important to the directors of the company, as after all it's their heads on the line if they expose the company to too much risk. So when we think about our unseen material, which often takes the form of a communication from one of the directors at the company, we can say that they're going to want to see your attitude to risk as part of your recommendation and part of your answer with regards to the strategic direction for the company. Finally, in my experience, we know that risk management crops up in a number of past exams. We know that it's really easy for the examiner to write issues with regards to risk management, and it also forms part of many questions on other subjects. So it's one of these really typical issues that crops up very commonly at operational level. So, we've discussed risk management. I hope you're ready now to move on to number 9 in our list, and that is the threat of new technology to Marici Power. Now, when we talk about new technology, I'm going to be focusing on two key ideas. The idea that there's new technology available with regards to the production of solar panels, or that there's new technology available for solar panels themselves. That is, that Marici Power need to change their products in order to make them more technologically competitive. And before we jump into the main body of new technology itself, just a bonus idea here for an example is Solar Impulse 2, a manned aircraft that recently circumnavigated the globe using solar power as its only form of power. What this means is that potentially solar panels could no longer be used to power electricity for consumption and at the grid, but as a direct powering mechanism for modes of transportation. So let's now get stuck in and look more at issue 9, this idea of new technology. And the reason I think this is quite so important is it's critical in solar. In fact, as you can see here, it's a critical success factor, a CSF, that their panels are up to date, and this is mainly measured by whether they have a high enough efficiency when converting sunlight into electricity. This idea of efficiency is something that permeates the entire business model of Marici, as they say that their focus is on maintaining their reputation as a producer of high quality panels. Whilst that may mean the structural integrity of the panels themselves, no one wants their panels to break after all, the main way that we define quality is whether they do what they say on the tin, whether they're good at producing electricity. It's also interesting that efficiency's recently taken a leap forward in Switzerland, where a research team created an insulite solar panel which produces record-breaking levels of electricity at efficiency of 36.4%. As we've said, however, it's not just the idea of the technology going into the panels themselves, which is part of this idea of new technology, and it could also be with regards to production methods. Indeed, the pre-scene tells us that because 2015 was a good financial year for many solar panel manufacturers, competitors have themselves invested in new machinery in order to produce more products and to produce better quality products. This means that although we know that Marici Power use one of the most advanced solar production facilities in the world, this status could be under threat because of investment by competitors, necessitating investment on the part of Marici Power in order to keep their production facility ahead of the competition. In fact, given that we're talking about investment and the requirements that technology may have for investment, it's good to just lean back on one of the key things we know about Marici Power, and that's their difficulty accessing capital and their difficulty accessing funds. Given that whether new technology takes the form of panel technology or production technology, it's likely to require heavy investment, we can say that this is a potential threat to Marici Power, as they're likely to have limited money to make investment quickly. And finally, as we move from my perspective to that of the examiner, what we can say is that new technology is a really easy topic to test. It's something that comes up frequently, and as such it's something the examiner's likely to throw into the mix, just as they know how to write a question on it, and they also know what they're looking for in an answer. So let's move on now to think about those likely issues in slightly more detail. And what we're going to think about here are those generic technology problems that examiners like to bring up and that we've seen frequently in previous exams. The first one is the idea of a new product, and with regards to Marici Power, this is likely to take the form of a new and more efficient solar panel. As we've just said, efficiency is one of the key things that customers are looking for, and so we know that improving our efficiency by having a new panel may attract an increased number of customers. However, what we've also got to bear in mind is that there are going to be costs associated with the production of a new panel, and we need to ask whether we can produce it at a level which is cost competitive with other panels. After all, for example, if we raise efficiency by 2%, but the overall cost of the panel raises by 500%, what we've actually got there is something that is still an inefficient investment for our customer, as they're going to take more time to get their money back on that solar panel due to the increased purchase price. Indeed, another sunk cost that we may need to think about is this idea of the cost of the research and development that goes into producing new and more efficient solar panels. However, when discussing this issue in the exam, we can talk about the idea that being technologically advanced is very important to a solar panel manufacturer, and as a result we know that they're going to want to keep research and development costs relatively high at all times anyway. So overall then, what we're going to need to do is make a decision about whether to proceed with this new product proposal, and in order to do that, you as the candidate will need to lay out the pros, lay out the cons, reason your way through using your logic, and make an informed decision based on that. Remember, although this is something you can start doing now and start thinking about how you'll frame your answer, you need to be prepared for new information in the unseen, changing the pros and cons of that decision. Finally then, we come to this last issue, which is less likely, but is something that the examiners like to bring up, and that's the idea of a new IT system. We know that there's very little on this in the pre-scene, IT isn't really mentioned, but it's a very common exam topic, and that's because what we need to do is do a really simple cost versus benefits analysis, which will typically be financial costs versus the idea of improved information storage and efficiency in order to make a recommendation. With this issue particularly, what we'll be looking out for is lots of information in the unseen. What we can now think about then are the key points we must raise when we think about new technology, and with regards to the benefits of new machinery IT, one of the key things is improved efficiency, leading to improved cost savings. However, obviously this needs to be balanced against the cost of that initial investment. It's also likely that safety could improve. However, one of the things we could mention with regards to Marici Power and the solar industry as a whole is that production tends to be highly automated, so there's already limited safety concerns with regards to our staff. When we talk about that slightly less likely issue of better information technology, better IT systems, we know that the idea is that gives us better decision making because we have access to more information. Again, one of the key things we balance that against is how much that's going to cost. Finally, when we think about the idea of new technology going into our panels and a new product, one of the ideas that I think is very important is the idea that they become more environmentally friendly. Given that as a solar panel manufacturer, environmental conscientiousness is one of the key factors in our decision making, this could be one of the really persuasive arguments to use in order to produce new panels. As we saw on previous pages, however, the key arguments are going to come down to this idea of efficiency and giving better efficiency to our customers versus the costs going into that panel and the price we have to charge customers as a result. As we see here then, when we consider disadvantages, the amount of upfront costs is one of the things we really need to consider. What's more, we can also talk about staff dissatisfaction. After all, if we improve our production methods to remove even more jobs and create even greater automation, this is going to result to job losses, and this redundancy could lead to union issues. One thing we can say with regards to the solar industry is workers are largely non-unionised, with the exception of the US solar labour market, and this means that the issue of union issues is relatively unlikely. Finally, when we think about staffing, we've got another couple of generic points, which is a lack of motivation due to this staff dissatisfaction at processes being automated, and an inherent resistance to change, which again is something that's typical of a staff response to changes in technology. We also need to think about the development time necessary for new technology and new systems, though as we've said, we're likely to have quite a high research and development budget, and this is something we could bring into our argument. We can also say that given that new technology will likely lead to new production methods, when we think about that side of things, new training could be required for staff, and that's another cost that we need to consider. However, given that our production methods are already very automated, it's more likely that what we're going to look at is improved technology to replace one machine with a new one, which is even more efficient. So, as a final thought on new technology and our final thought on issue 9, what we're going to consider is the theory we can use in order to support our argument when we're talking about this. The first method we're going to discuss is Porter's generic strategies, and this is all about how we think our product is going to market. And this is the idea that we consider whether our product has a broad or narrow scope, and whether the source of its competitive advantage is from being different or through cost. And through analysing our product along those matrices, we can decide whether we're a cost leader, whether we have a cost focus, whether we need to focus on differentiation or on a focus strategy. Thinking about what this means with regards to the solar industry and Marici Power specifically, we know that highly efficient panels are very desirable and therefore potentially easy to differentiate. We also know that lower cost panels lead to quicker return on our initial investment, that is for the customer, and this is something that they really want. So this actually leads us to suggest that the cost leadership strategy is also a good one. What we can say when we think about this competing information is that Marici Power have multiple products and so are definitely able to pursue multiple strategies in this way. When we think about technology, we can also think about it as part of our PESTLE analysis, and PESTLE's a mnemonic standing for the 6 important factors of political, economic, social, technology, environmental and legal. What we need to say, however, is that if we do all of those factors just to answer a specific technology question, we've brought in lots of wider industry knowledge that isn't necessarily applicable. So when using a PESTLE analysis, it's important that we're doing that to consider technology as part of an overall industry analysis question. Finally, we come to a model which is really generic and can be used across a wide range of question areas, and so it's really important that we know how to use it and use it well. Mendelow's matrix, we order our stakeholders with regards to their interest in the company and also the power they have in order to understand better how we should relate to them. One of the things we can say then is if we think about technology, we can think about our affected stakeholders, add those to our matrix and comment on their position. For example, if we know that employees are going to be upset by additional technology being brought into our production process, we can say that although they have a very high interest in the company, they have low power, and this can inform our decision-making process with regards to how we interact with them. So that concludes our look at issue 9 of this top 10 issues. I'm afraid for those of you watching the YouTube sample video, this is where that video ends. Obviously, I'd love for you to join me for the full video where we'll talk through the remaining 8 issues in a similar level of detail in order to get down to what I think are the most likely issues to come up during the exam. If you'd like to purchase the full video, please go to astranti.com and the operational case study pages, or follow the link below. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you'll join me for the full video.